Next up, we hear him all the time on the news making reports. We see his name mentioned in research papers. We see him quoted by people doing stories on school choice. From now on, I am going to refer to Corey as the voice of choice in the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, Corey DeAngelis. Corey,
Boom.
come on
Thank you
by.
so much. Thank you so much, Stephen, for the kind introduction. And you got the pronunciation correct. Hopefully everybody can hear me perfectly well. I'll try to get this done in less than 20 minutes. There's probably a lot more to say about school choice nationwide and in California right now than 20 minutes can handle, but hopefully you guys will have some great questions during the Q&A. So again, Corey DeAngelis, thank you again for having me. I just want to start out by saying how I define school choice and what it actually means to me, and how I talk about it and center the conversation around what most people call school choice, which a good reminder, last week was National School Choice Week. But let's, the way that I think about it is funding students as opposed to institutions, or funding students as opposed to systems. A lot of people get lost when you talk about things like school choice. So when we talk about it directly with what we mean, it's more so funding students as opposed to systems. And when we start to think about it this way, you can realize that there's a lot of other taxpayer funded initiatives that already work like this. For example, with higher education, we already fund the students directly through things like the Pell Grant for low-income students and the GI Bill for veterans, for example. With those programs, the funding goes to the student, and the student has a choice in the matter. They can take the funding to a public or private university of their choosing. When we think about things like the federal Head Start program, which is a pre-K initiative, or other state-funded pre-K initiatives all across the nation, the money doesn't go to a residentially assigned government-run institution. Instead, the money goes to the family, and the family has a choice in the matter. Again, they can choose a public or private provider of pre-K services. And we can go on and on and on with these types of examples in other industries, such as with the grocery stores, you have food stamps. With food stamps, we don't residentially assign low-income families to take that money to a government-run institution. No, instead, the money goes to the individual family, and the family can choose the provider of that service. They can take the money to Whole Foods, Safeway, Walmart, Trader Joe's. No particular institution is guaranteed that money. It goes to the family. We can go on and on with examples like Medicare and Medicaid, Section 8 housing vouchers, all of these other programs. The funding goes to the people. It doesn't go to a geographically assigned monopolistic institution like we have with K-12 education. So when I started to think about this, I started to see a lot of inconsistency from the other side. A lot of the people that support all of these other programs that fund individuals directly, and with higher education and pre-K education, they get all up in arms when it comes to the in-between years of K-12 education. And I think the one reason for that is that the power dynamics differ. When it comes to all of these other industries and all of these other levels of education, choice is the norm when it comes to higher education. Choice is the norm when it comes to pre-K education. And choice is the norm when it comes to grocery stores and any other essential industry in our economy. But choice threatens a K-12 entrenched special interest that profits from getting your children's education dollars, regardless of how well they do. And this year, regardless of whether they open their doors for business. What's interesting this year is that the case for school choice is stronger than it ever has been before. And families are starting to figure out more and more that there's no good reason to fund these closed institutions when you can fund the students directly instead. Just think about the difference in response that we've seen in California and nationwide to the pandemic, from the private schools and the public schools. With the private schools and so many other private businesses, including daycares and restaurants and grocery stores, they've either had their doors open this entire time or for a long time, or they've been fighting as hard as possible to open their doors for their customers, because they know that their customers can take their money elsewhere if they don't provide them with the services that they need. But on the other hand, so many public schools all across the nation, in particular in states like California, and their teachers unions have been fighting for the opposite. They've been fighting to keep their doors closed. And that's not to say that the people in the public sector are different people than the people in the private sector. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other or that one is more competent than the other. The difference is of incentives. One of these sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business. I mean, just look in San Diego County, for example. They've reported data on the reopening of about 90% of their public and private schools in the county. And I ran some analyses on this data, and about 55% of students in private schools are experiencing in-person instruction from the last time I checked. But in the public school sector, countywide in San Diego County, only about 2% of students were experiencing in-person instruction. But look at this big difference between the public and private sector. And again, I think it has to do with incentives. And we saw some crazy rent seeking coming from the teachers unions right when the closures started. Just think about in places like Oregon and Pennsylvania and in California, the teachers unions fought to prevent families from switching their children into virtual charter schools when the pandemic hit. And the reason for this was that the teachers unions and the defenders of the status quo understood that families were seeing virtual charter schools as a good option because they had been providing virtual education adequately for decades. We saw in Oregon, they lobbied straight to the government to make it illegal to switch. In California, they did something a little bit different, but had the same result. Senate Bill 98 blocked families from being able to take their kids to charter schools in the sense that the money was not allowed to follow the child to the charter school, which is under California law defined as a public school. Any other year would have been fine for the student to switch from a traditional school to a public charter school. But because of the rent seeking by the establishment to protect the monopoly at the expense of families, so many families, particularly underserved communities, were stuck waiting. Like the previous speaker said, waiting for Superman in a sense. Students that were already admitted to the charter schools through the lottery process were told that they couldn't come because it was not economically feasible after that bill blocked the money from following the child, which is a huge injustice, and it exacerbated inequities. And we also saw a lot of political demands from the teachers unions. One of the first this happened across the United States, don't get me wrong, but the first teachers union that sparked a conversation about this nationally was the Los Angeles Teachers Union. In their report for safely reopening schools, they called for more money. That was obvious, and more staffing. That was obvious. We expected all that. But then they started lumping in all these political demands in their report to safely reopen schools, which goes to show you that this had more to do with politics and power than it did have to do with safety. So one, they called for defunding the police, which has pretty much nothing to do with reopening schools safely. They called for Medicare for all, and they called for a wealth tax. What the heck does that have to do with reopening your schools safely for students? They also called, of course, to ban their competition. They wanted to ban all new charter schools and private school choice programs. And if this was about safety, wouldn't you be all for having more options for families? Because then you could spread students out to a lot of different classrooms. Then you could lower your class size in the public school system. Wouldn't that be safer? If it was truly about safety, they wouldn't be calling to ban their competition or to limit their competition. They would be calling to allow families to spread out to other opportunities. But they didn't do that. They did the opposite. There was more craziness going on in California in particular. But then I also want to point out from the private school side, there was a Catholic school in Sacramento County. As I said earlier, a lot of the private schools have been taking the fight against the government to try to reopen, whereas the public schools were fighting to remain closed, and they still are. Look at the Chicago Teachers Union stringing kids along every single week. Families are scrambling at the 11th hour being told that, well, we were supposed to go to in-person instruction today, but the teachers unions aren't showing up. So that's too bad for your children. And this is happening all across the country. But some of the private schools in some places, like Kentucky, for example, they took the fight all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to fight for the right to educate their children and to provide for their customers. And in California, there was a weird rule in Sacramento. I don't think it's in place right now, but in Sacramento County, they had a regulation to where the private schools weren't allowed to reopen for business, but the daycares were allowed to reopen for business, which begged the question, why is it okay for in-person and why is it not okay for in-person learning, but it is okay for in-person childcare services? Is it that the learning makes the virus more transmissible? Everybody knows the answer to that is obviously no. So this again shows that it was more about power and control. And a particular Catholic school in Sacramento County actually rebranded itself as a daycare center. It was a private school, but because of this ridiculous regulations, they tried to get around that regulation to fight to reopen for their customers. And they rebranded by retraining all of their employees as childcare workers. And the health official didn't like that, obviously. He said, oh, well, this is just a trick. You're just trying to get around our regulation.
No
You're still a
kidding.
school. Yeah, so obviously that's what they were trying to do. Yeah, you're right. It's because the regulation does not make any sense. And so that really went to show how just this hypocrisy from the other side. You had Governor Newsom sending his kid to in-person private schooling while, and then also in-person restaurants while having all these regulations in place for people not to be allowed to have their kids in in-person learning environments in the public school system, for example, and in-person restaurant dining experiences. So we saw a lot of this all across the country. And one more example of this and difference in the fight between the private and the public schools is in Los Angeles County. I'm not sure if they're still doing this, but they had a thing where you had to ask permission from the government and fill out forms in order to try to reopen your schools. And they were, approving them pretty slowly, but they broke down the data about how many of these applications were at private versus charter versus public schools. And disproportionately, it was more charter schools and a ton of private schools asking the government, please let us reopen for our families. Whereas even though public schools are the vast majority of schools, they were the minority in the number of applications to try to reopen for business. And again, it's not because the people in the public sector are bad. It's not because they don't know what they're doing. It's not because they're not in it for the kids. It's just that their incentives are aligned in a way that they get the same amount of benefits. They can still get their pay and job security regardless of whether they open their doors for business. The one way to fix that messed up set of incentives that are baked into that K through 12 public school monopoly is to fund the students directly. We wouldn't have had all of this mess to the degree that we've had it in the past year if we already had school choice, because then you'd have some type of bottom-up accountability to incentivize the public schools to do a good job for families.